Ever since I started shooting film photography, I have always used the same film lab to develop and scan all of my 35mm and medium format film. I'm always happy with the results. I always order high resolution TIFF scans so that I can edit them how I like, and they always look absolutely incredible. I've never really had any issues, but at £8 per roll for colour film and £12 per roll for black and white film, the cost obviously very quickly adds up, and as editable as the TIFF files are, I would like to be able to create my own look straight away with the initial scan files. So I have set about building my perfect home film scanning setup. My good friend Kyle McDougall has built plenty of home scanning setups in the past, and so I've enlisted his help to do so in this video. There is lots of parts to talk about in this setup, and obviously we're also going to use it to scan some film and compare those to my original lab scans. So let's get into it. For my home scanning setup, there is, of course, lots of different components, and we're going to break down each part individually. So let's just go over everything that I needed to make this work. To scan film at home, we of course need a digital camera, a macro lens system, some sort of copy stand to hold the camera parallel to the film, and then some sort of film holder and light source with which to view the film and hold it flat. We are going to talk about all of these components and how I ended up deciding on what I did for my setup, but before I did purchase anything a few months ago, I met up with Kyle and he talked me through his home scanning setup and gave me just a few little pointers.
So my home scanning setup, after I switched from using a dedicated film scanner, has gone through a couple iterations, but I mean, for the most part, they're all the same. They're just like bigger pieces of equipment or smaller pieces of equipment, but mine is made up of a copy stand, which is obviously essential for any setup. This one's a little bit overkill. You can use something much smaller. Obviously sturdy is nice. And then camera, using a GFX, adapter, macro lens. For me, this is a Pentax 645 macro, older lens, which works great. Obviously with like a APS-C or a full frame, you could use like an older vintage lens as well. And then just some sort of unit for 35 and 120. For me, for 4x5, I'm using just a light pad and a little bit of like a homebrew setup, which needs some work. But this one that I'm using, there's, I mean, obviously all sorts. This is a Veloy. There's like Negative Supply Co. and a bunch of others, but essentially just something to give you masks and film holders to keep it flat. So component-wise, it can be very straightforward. It's a matter of just like finding something that you can kind of dial in and then leave set up in one place. So a lot of the work essentially happens at the start when you're building out your kit and you're trying to figure out how to dial it in. And after you do that, then scanning is, you know, pretty quick, because it's essentially just coming and turning on your gear. It's all ready to go and you know what to do, and you can just fly through rolls of film in like a minute or 2 minutes, which is nice.
So from there, I went out and did some research of my own and found exactly what it was that I wanted to purchase to create my very first home film scanning setup. Let's break it down part by part and start off with the digital camera that I went for. Just a few videos ago, I mentioned that I picked up a Sony FX30 with its primary aim being a camera that I can quickly set up and shoot YouTube content with, just like this. But an added bonus of this camera is that it is actually capable of shooting 26 megapixel still images, which should be more than enough to capture some really high quality scans. As we just saw, Kyle has a very high resolution setup with his medium format Fuji camera. However, he's also made lots of videos talking about getting some great quality home scans using very cheap and much older second-hand digital cameras. So I was pretty confident that my 26 megapixel Sony FX30 was going to be more than enough. From here, we of course had to pick up a macro lens that would be capable of getting very close to my film negatives and focusing at a very short distance, really taking some sharp images. The macro lens system that I went with was actually one that Kyle himself had previously used in a budget scanning setup, and that was the Canon 50mm FD mount f3.5 macro lens. I also purchased a Canon FD25 extension tube to go with this lens, as well as a cheap fully manual FD to Sony E-mount adapter so that the lens could of course be compatible with my FX30. So we have the camera and we have the lens mounted to it, and the next thing that I had to tackle for this setup was finding a way to mount that camera parallel to my film negatives. For this, I turned to Facebook Marketplace. There were some fairly budget brand new options out there that I did find when doing some research, but they were just a little bit out of my price range when considering everything else that I was purchasing for the setup. I scanned some secondhand sites like eBay and eventually found on Facebook Marketplace a copy stand that was being sold near me, and I drove out that day and picked it up for just £20. This particular model seems to be from Poland and is a PZO-UR9711 copy stand. It has an easily adjustable height using the little wheel knob on the side of the stand and has a little 3/4 mount built in to the camera holder right here. It's super simple, it's a little beat up around the edges, but it is built like a tank, does everything that I need it to do, and at £20 I was never going to complain. The next thing that I needed to purchase is perhaps one of the most important parts of the setup, and that is some sort of system to hold the film flat and advance between frames. For this, I decided to go with the professional scanning kit from Veloy. Veloy offered many different options for film holders, and they have multiple kits to cater to different levels of budgets and needs as well. I very nearly went with the most simple and cheapest option that they have, but for me, this was part of the kit that I really didn't want to cheap out on, and I wanted to make sure that my scanning experience at home was as easy and enjoyable as possible, as well as being future-proof. But you absolutely could get by with one of the cheaper offerings that Veloy has. The professional kit comes with the CineStill cs-lite as the light source, a really nice holder for this that keeps it nice and tightly attached with the film holders, and also allows you to really quickly adjust your level with some leveling feet on the bottom of the holder. It also comes with an advancer, which thus far hasn't been super useful, as the negatives that I've always gotten back from my lab are cut into smaller strips of either 6 or 4 or even 3 for medium format, but now that I'm going to be using this setup at home, I will be asking my lab to send me the fully uncut strips of negatives back, and when I'm scanning that many images at once, it'll definitely be incredibly useful to use the advancer for that. The kit then comes with a holder for 35mm film, as well as a holder for medium format 120 film, and it also comes with masks for each different medium format negative size, so that it reduces any light that is getting into the lens when I'm scanning 120 negatives that are smaller than 6x9. And obviously I only have 6x6 and 6x7 medium format cameras, and so this was definitely a big bonus to get those masks included. The final couple of items, which are definitely not necessary but were certainly helpful to have come with the professional scanning kit, were the duster and the leveling mirror. Again, the duster will be more useful when shooting a full roll of film, but it does help fairly well with removing those bigger dust particles, which can really show up in film scans. It definitely doesn't remove 100% of dust though. And the leveling mirror is absolutely a useful tool when first setting up to scan film, as you use it to get your camera set up perfectly parallel to the film, ensuring the best possible results. The kit came in at a total of a little over £300 here in the UK, and for what is included in the kit, I definitely think that it is a worthwhile purchase. So that was all the physical hardware pieces purchased that I required to shoot the film, and all that was left was some sort of a conversion process. For this, I decided to go with a vastly popular and recommended piece of software, which is Negative Lab Pro. This is a plugin for Lightroom that automatically does all of the conversion process and allows you to tweak a lot of the settings to get the desired look that you're after. This was perhaps my main reason for wanting to start scanning my own film at home, really fine-tuning a look that I can then replicate with all of my scans going forwards. So once I had all of that purchased, that was all I needed to start scanning my own film at home. I took this setup over to Kyle's studio before I scanned everything at home so that I could draw on his knowledge and gain some tips as to getting the best results. We set everything up, and we actually ran into a couple little hiccups and found a few quirks that we had to work around. Firstly, the aperture on the 50mm f/d lens didn't seem to always be opening and closing properly. It was something to do with the locking mechanism on the mount adapter and the extension tube. With all of that connected, it seemed to be stopping the lens from properly adjusting the aperture. We eased off the connections a little bit, ensuring that everything was still firmly locked in, but in slightly different positions, and the aperture once again was opening and closing perfectly fine. We scanned both some 35mm film, which was black and white and was shot on my Contax G1, and I also brought some medium format color film, which I shot on the Pentax 6.7. Switching between these different formats was where I found another quirk of this setup. I actually didn't need the extension tube when shooting the medium format images. I could focus close enough on the negative when I raised the camera higher up on the copy stand, and so I had to ditch the extension tube for that. This was also the case when setting up the scanning setup, as initially it's recommended that you focus on your lens using the mirror that comes with the Veloy Advanced Scanning Kit, and I couldn't focus on that properly with the extension tube connected, and so there was a little bit of back and forth and connecting and disconnecting that throughout the scanning process. Of course, this is only an issue when first setting up to scan a roll of film. Once it was done for the first time, I could then fire through an entire roll or multiple if I wanted, but it did make the initial setup just a little bit more tedious. As I said, I scanned both some 35mm and some medium format 6x7 negatives, and this was literally the very first time that I had scanned anything with my own setup that I was going to be using going forward, and so I was super excited to see the results. Let's take a look. Honestly, I was incredibly happy with how these first images converted when I first got them into Lightroom and Negative Lab Pro. The completely unedited conversions looked great and looked very similar to the lab scans which I had received, but I had the bonus flexibility of really being able to dial in the look that I wanted. Both color and contrast is easily editable in these files, and there was plenty of latitude still in the highlights and shadow areas to be able to adjust the exposure as I desired. The only real discernible difference between the scans was the sizes of the file and the levels of detail. Now, the lab scans obviously are sharpened by the lab, and thus I've always been amazed at just how incredibly sharp the scans are that I get back. Whereas with this home scanning setup, there is no sharpening in the camera. I have to add all of the sharpening in Lightroom and in post-production. And I do think it's going to take me a little while just to really dial in the best sharpening settings for my setup. Because I also opt for the highest resolution files that I can get from the lab, they are incredibly large files and are obviously going to be more detailed than the scans I get out of my Sony FX30. This initial scanning test also showed me that the view of the negatives on the screen is not actually the entire image that gets taken, and using just the small screen that's on the Sony FX30 was a little bit difficult. I realized that I had a lot of area in my images that I actually had to crop out, and so I could have actually had my camera and lens closer to the negatives in order to get the maximum resolution out of the FX30. So having had this little learning experience scanning with Kyle, using his knowledge, I decided to go through a whole batch of some of my favorite images which I have stored at home and hopefully scan them properly, giving myself a fair representation of what my images could look like going forwards. Let's jump in and take a look at those scans and compare a few to the high quality lab scans that I normally receive. As I said, for these scans I did make a few slight tweaks to my process to ensure that I got the best possible results, based off of the quirks that I found when shooting with Kyle. I attached my video monitor to my Sony FX30 with a clean feed so that I could see exactly how big the negative actually was in frame, and this meant that I got the largest resolution scans that I possibly could. I also for this ensured that I wore gloves, carefully dusted all of the negatives off and passed it through the advancer to keep the film perfectly tight and parallel. There was still a little bit of dust present, that's always going to be the case, and I did gain between 300 to 600 pixels on pretty much every negative. And when editing, I used Lightroom sharpening to really dial in some settings there to ensure that for web purposes, those images were as sharp as they could be. And overall, I think that this scanning setup really is going to be incredibly useful for me going forwards. Is there perhaps a slight downgrade in quality from my normal scans? Yes, probably. I think if I was printing my images large, then you could definitely tell the difference, but for the purposes of sharing online and in these videos, the quality is still incredibly high and something that I'm very happy with. I have the added flexibility of being able to really edit the images to be the look that I want them to be, and I'm saving £5 or £6 with each roll of film that I shoot. That will add up to a hell of a lot in the long run. This was a great learning experience for me in terms of gaining the knowledge of how to scan film at home, and it really actually excites me for how well going forward I'm going to be able to really dial in that look that I like with my film photography, gain really easily some nice scans whilst not really compromising on the quality that much. Going forward, I don't think there is that much that I want to tweak to the setup really, but Kyle did point out to me an awesome looking Vivitar macro lens that wouldn't require an extension tube and thus would take away the need to switch out setups depending on whether I'm shooting 35mm or 120 film. So I definitely think that if there's going to be an upgrade soon, that will be the next upgrade to my scanning process. I know that this wasn't a super deep dive into the process of scanning film at home, but I would love to work on a video in the near future giving a really detailed walkthrough of my entire process once I've worked everything out and really dialed in all the settings that I want to use. So do let me know if that is something that would interest you. That is going to be all for this one. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I know it was a bit of a long one, but if you did, consider leaving me a like, let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below, and maybe consider subscribing if you want to see some more of my content going forwards. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, I'll see you in the next one.